Now, when we look at the significance of the day, looking at how people can cultivate self-acceptance and also society embracing inclusivity, what does it speak to us,
Well, acceptance, the International Day of Acceptance, is actually an important day to celebrate and encourage the inclusion of people with disabilities. We do know that people, humans generally pass through different stages in their lives and maybe have certain conditions or maybe in certain circumstances or situations. But accepting their disabilities, for example, is an important part of their life. We do know that people with mental health conditions, for example, may be at risk of having lots of disabilities, and they may be at risk of experiencing exclusion. Mental health conditions are common. For example, the World Health Organization estimates that 1 in every 4 people is at risk of having a mental health condition in their lifetime. But 90% of those who need mental health care are not having access to evidence-based medications or psychosocial interventions. So one of the major drivers of this huge treatment gap for people with mental health conditions is stigma, the societal, negative societal response to people living with mental health conditions and indeed other disabilities. So it's time really to ensure that individuals living with disabilities accept their situation, and it's also important for the society to ensure that these individuals are included in policies, in practices to ensure their collective well-being.
Okay, Doctor, I would like to digress a bit beyond persons with disabilities. The issue of mental health is very serious and people tend not to talk about it. I'm sure you're aware of that. People tend to, stigmatize persons who have presented themselves as vulnerable to show that they have dealing with one form of mental issue or the other. How can society break that barrier?
Yeah, it's important, as I said. One of the major drivers of the treatment gap for mental health conditions, where 90% of those who need mental health care are not having the care they need, is the stigma. Mental health conditions are common. Since 1 out of every 4 people is at risk of having a mental health condition, it means everyone is really at risk. And mental health is actually a continuum from being perfectly well. We do know the definition of health as being a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, and not merely the absence of disease or infirmity. So just as health is, mental health is also a continuum. No one would be said to be perfectly mentally healthy. And then the two extremes are being perfectly mentally healthy and then having a mental illness. But we all hover around these two extremes, which means everyone is at risk of having a mental health condition depending on their vulnerabilities. So we should look at this as something affecting everyone, affecting all of us, and everyone is at risk. I think this attitude can really help us in ensuring that we support people living with mental health conditions and ensure their inclusion in activities.
You know, the first step to getting self-help is acceptance, Doctor. And people with mental health, accepting that, of course, is the first goal. But in an environment, like a working environment, how can that be identified? Should they be, form of segregation? Is that necessary? You know, people who have presented themselves in a working environment that they're dealing with one form of mental issue or the other. What would you advise for a working environment?
Yeah, it's important, given the universality or the prevalence of mental health conditions. It's likely we see many people living with mental health conditions in the workplace. And we do know that the World Economic Forum and Harvard University, economists from these two organizations really estimate that mental, neurological, and substance use disorders will cost the global economy $16.3 trillion in the period 2010 to 2030. That's more than cancer, diabetes, and respiratory diseases when you combine these. So, which means most of this is actually due to lost economic productivity. So people living with mental health conditions such as depression and anxiety in the workplace are at risk of being stigmatized. And it really leads to a lot of lost economic benefits because they may not be able to perform optimally, and this amounts to the lost economic productivity. So it's important really for organizations and employees and other people in the society to ensure that people with mental health conditions in the workplace are supported and are linked with the appropriate mental health support for them to realize their full potential and be productive.
Okay, I'd like to also look a bit on the issue of, the plight of persons with disabilities. They face a lot of discrimination because of their disability. Now, there's ability and disability, that's what they say, but it starts with that individual accepting that there is ability in my disability. What would you advise persons with disabilities on the aspect of accepting who they are?
Yeah, it's really critical for people with disabilities to accept who they are. That's the ideal situation where we look at everyone looking at who they are really, not who we expect them to be. So it starts with the individual, really, to accept their condition. It's something they cannot change. Accepting it is the best strategy because that will enable them to really focus on achieving their goals. Because when you do not accept it, for example, there's this tendency you may not be able to focus on achieving your life goals. Not achieving your life goals would further increase your risk of having a mental health condition, for example. And that can just lead to a cycle of dissatisfaction and disability, further disability. So accepting the situation is really critical. And then this can really help in propelling their aspirations forward.
All right, Dr. Muftahu Mohammed, we look forward to having a society where values, ethics, and of course, acceptability thrives. Thank you so much for your time on Panorama.
Thank you for having me.
He is a consultant psychiatrist.